So let me give a quick introduction to what this webinar is about. This webinar is the second in a series of bi-monthly webinars in the series called Securities and Justice Futures. Basically, we aim to confront the dilemmas, reimaginings, and futures of security and justice from a cross-regional perspective. We're drawing from a range of speakers from North and South contexts. The series also seeks to engage with both academic and practitioner audiences, and also to encourage mutual dialogue on the futures of security and justice in diverse contexts. My name is Annette Hübschle. I'm from the Global Risk Governance Program at the University of Cape Town. We're one of the partners in the seminar series. It's also co-hosted by Julie Burke from the Scottish Centre for Justice and Security. I hope I got that right. And Mutuma Ruturi from the Kenyan Centre for Crime Statistics. I hope I got that right. Let me, with further ado, give an introduction to our speakers. So today we're talking about sorry, lost my settings, prison settings. We're looking at innovations in prison settings and as well as Justice Reimagined. We have two really amazing speakers. Our first speaker will be Professor Máximo Sozzo. He's from the National University of Litoral, and he's also a Leverlhume visiting professor at the School of Law, University of Edinburgh. Professor Sozzo is a professor of sociology of law and criminology at the National University of Litoral in Argentina, and he's also visiting the University of Edinburgh in 2024-25. His research is focused on punishment and society in Latin America, and he has published many books. The most recent one is entitled Decolonizing the Criminal Question. Professor Sozzo is going to talk first. Then our second speaker is Professor Fergus McNeill. He's Professor of Criminology and Social Work at the University of Glasgow. And he works in the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. He is also the chair of board of the Howard League for Penal Reform. And prior to becoming an academic in 1998, Fergus worked for a decade in residential drug rehabilitation and as a criminal justice social worker. Yeah, something that stood out from Fergus's bio is that he's also an award-winning singer-songwriter, so I had to mention that. So without further ado, let's start our proceedings. I just want to ask everyone to switch off their videos while the speakers are presenting. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A. Our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes each. And after that, we will have a Q&A session. So you can either post your questions in the chat, or you can switch on your video and microphone and ask the questions in person. So without further ado, Máximo, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Annette and Julie, for the invitation. I will try to share my screen. Please let me know if it is working well. Is working well? Yeah?
It's fine. Perfect.
Perfect. So I will share in this brief 15 minutes some ideas around struggle, innovation, and harm reduction in contemporary prison from experiences that has been going on in my country, in Argentina, and more generally, I think, in some way, I will try to generalize to other places of the Global South. In the last years, in the last decades, Latin America in general has experienced an incredible growth of incarceration rates. As you can see in this graph, when we compare the incarceration rates at the beginning of the 1990s with the ones in our present, 2022, 2023, well, the increase is really extreme. If we see this in this other graph, with the percentage of increases of incarceration rates, some cases are really, really astonishing, like El Salvador or Brazil. So this is a common trend, but with a strong level of variations in the different countries of Latin America, from extreme cases like the ones of El Salvador to more moderate increases like the one of Mexico. But 12 out of 18 countries at least duplicated its incarceration rate in 30 years and then triplicated in the same period. And this has produced, of course, dramatic effects inside and outside the walls of the prisons, from overcrowding to different forms of violence and human rights abuses. This has been in some way even more problematic nowadays, because in some cases we are seeing the emergence of new forms of authoritarian populism that has in some way deepened the punitive term. The example of El Salvador is well known, and also now in our country, in Argentina, since 2023, with the new government that has really produced a turn towards ultra-right position. For those in the academic, social and political fields who embrace the opposition to prison, a process and situation like this invites the construction of catastrophic visions of an epochal change that translates frequently into a form of pessimism that could condemn to inaction. So in this paper that I am trying to build, I draw on 3 case studies of changes in the world of prisons in one of these scenarios of Latin America, in Argentina, and a scenario that has experienced an incredible growth of the incarceration rate, 266% between 1992 and 2022. But these changes, the ones that I have been studying in the last couple of years, had a certain capacity with different extension and intensity to generate effects of harm reduction of imprisonment. I will not have time to go through in detail around these 3 changes. I will just briefly comment some main characteristic of them, but the 3 changes that I have been working on is the creation of state institutions for monitoring and oversight of prisons, the multiplication of university programs inside prisons, and the authorization of the use of mobile phones by prisoners. I will jump directly one of these 3 because I will not have time to go through them in detail. But since the 1990s, the first one, the creation of these institutions, state institutions of monitoring and oversight of prison conditions. Since the 1990s, state institutions dedicated to this task have been created. In relation to federal prisons, Argentina is a federal state, so we have federal prisons and also provincial prisons, 23 different provincial prison services. In relation to the federal prisons, in which this movement, this development has been the most important one, there were 3 new institutions that were created. First, the Procuración Penitenciaria de la Nación, that is a sort of ombudsman specialized in relation to the rights of prisoners, an institution that has grown quite a lot since its creation in 1993, especially since 2003, a moment in which this institution began to be part of the legislative power at the federal level. Now it has a very important capacity and a reach that is really, really quite strong. It has 11 regional delegations and more than 250 workers. And they do things that we can see in other jurisdictions of the Global South and the Global North, like the reception of complaints, inspections, building reports and recommendations, do some administrative interventions, but also a very strong judicial litigation. Another very interesting institution in that sense is the Public Defense Office, that has created a prison commission in 1998 and a program against institutional violence in 2013. That is a, let's say, smaller institution with some specialized small teams that also have a strong relation with public defenders all over the countries and do some things that are quite in common with the ones of the Procuración Penitenciaria de la Nación, and more recently, the creation of the National Committee for the Prevention of Torture in 2017, that is an institution that is quite complex because as a federal country, we have a national committee for the prevention of torture, but also some local mechanisms at the provincial level. And this institution also produces inspections, reports and recommendations, and administrative and political interventions. All these three institutions that I have briefly described have developed different levels of conflict and cooperation with the Federal Penitentiary Service and the political authorities in charge of penitentiary policy over the last 3 decades in relation to different political junctures, intervention strategies, and characteristics of the different institutions. But they develop a strong capacity to point out publicly from the outside, but with direct contact with prisoners through different channels, problems of non-compliance with the law and violations of rights of the prisoners by the prison authorities and guards. What we have labeled in a recent couple paper as sort of contested transparency and accountability. There are several examples of moments of extreme or intense conflict with prison authorities and prison service more generally. It's like, for example, a report on torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment by the Procuración Penitenciaria de la Nación in 2009, the litigation of cases of killings and tortures, and the conviction of prison authorities and guards. There were 7 cases, 33 prison officers were convicted by these crimes, all of them litigated by the Procuración Penitenciaria de la Nación, and a more recent and closer to me experience that is the inspection of the committee, the National Committee for the Prevention of Torture in the province of Santa Fe, in response to an allegation of widespread torture in the context of searches and collective isolation procedures of high-risk prisoners that has produced strong tensions with political and prison authorities in these last months. So these 3 institutions has developed these kind of practices with, let's say, a strong level of conflict. Another interesting development, another interesting change is the multiplication of university programs inside prisons. But because I don't have enough time, I will jump this and I will go directly to the third example. That is a very interesting one, I think. It's the process of authorization of the use of mobile phones in some provinces of Argentina, something that has happened after the closure of the prisons during the pandemic of COVID-19. But in one case, the province of Chaco, a poor province in the context of Argentina, we have seen a very interesting innovation that could be considered an innovation from the periphery of the periphery. Because the temporary authorization to the use of mobile phones while there was a suspension of visits in these prisons in Chaco, was transformed in May 2022 in a permanent authorization. And it was a very interesting decision because there was a strong role of the local committee for the prevention of torture. That was the first committee for the prevention of torture that was created at the provincial level. It was created in 2011. We have seen in different fieldworks, a survey and some interviews with prisoners, the strong use of cell phones today inside the provincial prisons of Chaco. 92% of prisoners that we survey consider that prison officers have changed their behavior as a result of their possession of mobile phones. And this has produced different kinds of transformations, a new channel of communication with different kinds of institutions that are in charge of oversight of the prison conditions in Chaco, reduction of situations of institutional violence and also violence by prisoners. We have here these descriptions of how the use of mobile phones become a dissuasive tool in the everyday life inside prisons in Chaco. And also we have seen in the last couple of years the production of evidence in criminal proceedings around human rights violations by prisoners themselves using their cell phones. And finally, there is a very interesting use of the cell phone as a way of producing collective organization by prisoners themselves. Today, every Tuesday, the delegates from the different prisons in Chaco have an online meeting, and the delegates from the police lockups have also a meeting every week on Fridays. This has produced a huge level of political tension, and in the last months, there were different attempts to ban the use of cell phones inside prisons. And just a week ago, the provincial legislature has produced a new law that prohibits the possession and use of mobile phones. And there is now a huge debate and conflict about the implementation of this new legislation that is quite obviously regressive, and it's part of this more general political and cultural climate in Argentina today around this new form of authoritarian populism that I have mentioned before. So some thoughts around these three cases. First, 50 years later, we can go back to the Politics of Abolition by Thomas Matthiessen and think about these reforms or changes as some sort of non-reformist reforms or negative reforms, in which it is clear that the reforms are separating themselves from the logic of the legitimacy of the prison in this jurisdiction, and they clearly are trying to build alternatives to a more effective functioning of the system, to use Thomas Matthiessen words. Of course, we need to consider that this classification of positive and negative reforms have to be rethought today, as Matthiessen himself presented 10 years ago in his reflection on the new edition of the Politics of Abolition, and concepts like independent reforms or non-discipline reforms that have been present in this text 10 years ago are quite interesting in order to think of them. There is a fundamental role of the language of law and rights in these different mutations, and I think it's a very, very important element in trying to build alternatives to the language of rehabilitation that was always the language of legitimation of imprisonment in Argentina. And we can add to this that these three changes are part of this contested transparency that I have already mentioned. As Matthiessen said in 1974, the negating reforms have unmasked the system attempts to mask its true nature. In other words, the negating reform abolishes aspects of that reality, aspects of this, and so that reality becomes unconcealed. It's very interesting how all these changes has been produced by external actors in direct contact with prisoners. These external actors, in some cases, preceded these struggles, but all of them are part of these struggles around prison that are going on since the transition to democracy in this country in the 1980s. These external actors have produced different kind of links with prisoners, but in some cases, as in the university programs, in particular, the one that I didn't have time to describe in detail, it has been translated in the construction of collective organizations of prisoners. So we can see here that the prison becomes, even in a context of mass incarceration, of an incredible punitive term, a field of constant struggle in a broad sense by different actors with different types and amounts of resources, that a struggle that have different intensities and modalities, but is a contradictory field in which we can see general and dominant trends and orientations, such as the punitive term, but also at the same time, there are constantly challenges, as Goodman, Phelps, and Page put it, who oppose these trends and may pave the road for a more general transformation in the future. So we are seeing some sort of paradoxical situation: growing incarceration and paroxysmal deterioration of the conditions of prison life, but at the same time, multiplication and enlargement of its porosity, permeability, and struggles from outside and from inside, both by state and non-state actors around what happens in prison. So a prison that is more degraded and inhuman, but at the same time, more open and contested. There are several interesting comments in punishment and society literature in the last years around how paying attention to these struggles and the role of the different actors in building punishment or prison can be a very interesting way of thinking about future possibilities. I just put these two quotations from David Garland and Philip Goodman, Michelle Phelps, and Joshua Page that I think are quite interesting. So, of course, we need to avoid the risk of naive optimism, but I think that these three kind of very different kind of changes in the prison field in Argentina give us some hope about the real possibilities of political and legal action for our present and future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Máximo. Brilliant presentation. Fergus, without further ado, over to you.
Okay. Okay, can everybody see that? Yeah, that's visible. Yes. And I'm audible, so all good.
Yes, I can see.
Excellent, great. Okay, well, I can follow on in several ways from Máximo's presentation. Maybe first by stressing that the work I'm going to present comes primarily from an examination of people's lives post-prison or post-punishment. And in particular, it draws on a project called Distant Voices, where we explored reintegration, or the realities and possibilities of reintegration and the limits of reintegration after state punishment. There's a link here. The top link takes you to the website of that project, where there are lots of different resources. But the graphic and the link at the bottom relate to a theatre show, which was a product of our work and which is coming to the Edinburgh Fringe this year, so I couldn't resist a little advert. You can get tickets if you can be in Edinburgh in August. And I wanted to put that in this slide because I think this piece of gig theatre, as it's called, is an exceptionally powerful articulation of some of the alienating binaries that are produced by adversarial justice systems. And even as somebody who's worked in or studied criminal justice systems since the 1990s, involvement with this project and particularly its creative methodologies brought home to me in ever more powerful ways the nature of the alienation that these binaries produce. So I'm talking about binaries between criminal and law-abiding, between innocent and guilty, between responsible and not responsible, victim and offender, incorrigible, redeemable, to pick up on Máximo's reference to rehabilitative logics. It seems to me that the adversarial systems that produce these binaries are part of wider mechanisms of colonization of the life world by systems, the systems produced by modernity and exported through the project of colonization, or rather, perhaps the temporal order there is different. The two things are symbiotic in their relationships. But I'm not going to dwell too much on that here because there's too much to say. And I want to skim across a lot of slides here in order to allow you to pick up on what you want to question or discuss further at the end. So I'm starting with alienating binaries produced by adversarial justice. Contra that perspective, the generative justice that I'm going to define and speak about in most of this talk rests on an understanding of crime and punishment as relational problems, fundamentally as relational problems. It's not just that crime harms social relationships, it's that crime is often a product of pre-existing harms, state-generated harms, structural harms that represent disintegration or relational breakdown of different sorts. So as in the cycle here, disintegration is generative of offending and reoffending, but our responses to offending and reoffending in adversarial systems tend towards the punitive and the disintegrative. So we get caught in this cycle. It's worth noting here, though, that adversarial systems like debate more generally, which translates literally as beating down from the Latin, debare, to debate, those systems and practices tend to deny recognition and they deny dialogue or prevent dialogue, and that gets in the way of relational repair. So we have individual solutions, in inverted commas, administered through adversarial systems to relational problems. The emphasis on relationality has emerged in lots of different quarters recently, and Laura Beth Nielsen, in her presidential address to the Law and Society Association conference last year, made a pitch to move towards an understanding of relational rights. And here she defines that as a model of rights and more broadly law in many forms that recognizes the pervasiveness, importance, and centrality of relationships in social life. And the project of focusing on relational rights, she says, should be positive in meaning that we seek to find and to do work that reveals the importance of relationships, that identifies how they connect to law and justice, and that allow us to articulate a vision for how to use law more effectively in shared social struggles. But as well as being positive, relational rights work needs to be public, and that means it needs to be engaged in dialogues with others beyond the academy. And I think the Distant Voices project and the gig theatre piece, A Giant on the Bridge, which I mentioned previously, is a very good example of both positive and public work. So to get to the point, generative justice, what do we mean by it? I'm drawing here on work with Mary Corcoran and Beth Weaver and a wider network of scholars who have got together because we've started to recognize certain similarities in projects and places and communities with which we've been engaged over many years. And what we're interested in, we realize, is social processes and community practices that involve justice-affected people or formerly incarcerated people that are somehow generative of relationships characterized by solidarity. So essentially, there's a puzzle here. How is it that people who've suffered the alienating binaries of criminal justice, who've suffered criminalization and stigmatization, how is it that they sometimes, in certain contexts, in certain communities, find a way forward, find a way beyond punishment and into relationships characterized by solidarity? And here, the generative in generative justice refers to or reflects the Latin generare, which means to beget or to procreate. So we're interested in the creative, we're interested in the productive. We thought we had coined the term generative justice when we coined that definition, but of course, Google soon revealed that we were wrong, and that an American scholar called Ron Eglash, who just as a matter of curiosity, happens to be the son of Albert Eglash, one of a key restorative justice scholar from a previous generation. Ron is a professor of information science in the University of Michigan, an expert in cybernetics. But what's intriguing about his work is that he's interested in the relationship between indigenous knowledges and cultures and new technologies. So he's far removed from criminology, but nonetheless, he came to this concept of generative justice and defines it as relations of open reciprocity, communal sharing, gift giving, and collaboration that allow value to circulate in unalienated forms, including labor, power, political expression, and even interspecies ecological exchanges. He's interested in ecological and environmental issues too. So we discovered Ron's work and we're now in dialogue with it, but I'm going to focus more on the internal thinking in our network. So generative justice for us attends to the harms of criminalization as well as crime. It's more prospective than retrospective, more concerned with the future than the past. It insists on connections between criminal and social justice, and it locates the generative responses often in ideas and practices which are outside of conventional criminological canon or outside of criminal justice systems, particularly of the global north. And I mean the reference here to be both to beyond the criminological canon of the global north and beyond the criminal justice systems of the global north. And I'll come back to the decolonizing question at the end. One of the things that we did early in our dialogue was try to identify what was the process, the practice process and the community dynamics that people went through in order to arrive at these positions of solidarity in places of generative justice. And I haven't got time to articulate all of the elements in the process here, but very briefly, I discerned this this articulation of those processes from my experiences in Scotland, but the presentation of this seems to have resonated with other projects, re-entry projects that others have experienced in several different countries, including Sergio's here today, and Sergio has used this framework to think about his work in Brazilian prisons. So there is connection, at least one connection to the global south there. But essentially what we're talking about is practices where communities and projects, first of all, meet people with moral recognition of their worth and dignity. And that is actively communicated in a variety of ways in the encounters between those people and these communities. One of the most important ways that it's communicated is through the communication of an expectation of participation and contribution. So immediately people are dignified by the expectation that they will make a contribution to the common good of the community and not merely be a recipient of service or somebody who has needs that have to be met, or even worse, somebody who has risks, who's seen as a risk to the well-being of the community. So moral recognition undergirds the communication of worth and hope and a belief in the possibility of a meaningful contribution. There is, though, material provision for people in need in the context of these projects. So people leaving prison might be supported, for example, with mobile phones or phone credits, or recycled or upcycled or shared furniture or food parcels or any kind of material provision. But that is offered and received in the expectation of exchange or paying forward in some way in the future. So again, the notion of being a mere recipient of care is undermined by the way in which these dynamics operate. Through the processes that I've articulated already, social connections are forged and reciprocal concern for one another emerges. The private troubles that people face in this context, in the context of re-entry, are socialized in these processes. Through reciprocal concern and through social connection, people identify, if you like, the public issue that lies behind their personal troubles, and that often leads to collective efforts, sometimes campaigning, sometimes political participation, sometimes just frankly plugging the gaps in what state and civil society institutions do and don't provide in the context of re-entry. But there is, in many contexts, a developing desire to seek and deliver change beyond the individual. So what is it that generative justice is generating? Well, so far I've focused on solidarity, and that was the kind of way in for me, trying to understand how solidarity emerged in these places. And I think of it as a relational architecture. I'm drawing here on the work of Beth Weaver in her book on offending and desistance, but also in her subsequent work on social cooperatives. And she draws a lot on the Italian relational sociologist Pier Paolo Donati, who talks about reciprocity and mutual exchange as the generating mechanisms of social relations, generating and regenerating social bonds, and a kind of investment in relational goods, a valuing of relationships. Obviously, this relates to interdependence and trust, but it also relates to the development of responsibility as a value, responsibility for one another. So not responsibility in the adversarial criminal justice system's sense of holding you responsible for your conduct, but rather a different and more collectivized sense of responsibility in this context. More recently in the network, we've been thinking about the relationship between generative justice and justice, of course. And here we've talked about and begun to explore epistemic justice, which, as people will probably know, relates to the question of which knowledge counts or is counted, and also who has the right to interpret in the sense of hermeneutic justice and injustice, that knowledge. So epistemic justice, social justice, redistributive justice, relational justice. But broadly speaking, we're talking about forms of justice that seek ways to enable those individual contributions through the establishment of right relationships between people and communities in order to contribute to and produce a collective good. And that, as we unpick it, suggests the development of certain dispositions within each individual and within a group, but also the development and distribution of resources, hence social justice and distributive justice, and engagement with the question of people's positions and mobilities in social groups, which relates again back to practices of recognition. Ultimately, I think, as I see it now, the pursuit of justice in any of these contexts depends on recognition And dialogue also depends on recognition. We can't discuss what justice is or how to seek it until we value each other through recognition. So I think that there are links here to traditional justice practices, to restorative justice practices, to transformative justice movements. And again, in the group, we're beginning to try to make those connections. I'm conscious that I'm skimming across a lot of material here very quickly, but as I said, I'm trying to do that so that you can pick what it is that you would like to discuss further in the Q&A. So last couple of slides. I think there's also a link here to the generation of safety, and if you like, security. We know from Black Lives Matter, from the transformative justice movements in the States and elsewhere, that in many respects and in many places, people are seeking safety from the state and from its violences, systemic and symbolic, but also bureaucratic violences. Sometimes we're involved in seeking safety, therefore, beyond the state, in civil society and in the community and the life world that we inhabit together. But of course, as Máximo's comment about naive optimism applies here too, there's plenty of violence in communities and in civil society. So the pursuit of safety also requires a different set of considerations in those contexts. But broadly, if we're seeking safety, then we will need the state to operate at least redistributively to equip communities with the resources that are generative of safety. And I make the connection here finally to the work of Máximo and others on decolonizing the criminal question, because that work stresses the analysis of the temporal, spatial, and subjective dimensions of the decolonizing project. Temporal in the sense, if I'm understanding it correctly, of understanding our histories more clearly and tracing the antecedents of our current problems. Spatial, and obviously in the sense of looking at movements between regions and countries, north to south, south to north, and in many other directions, but also subjective in relation to some of the questions of epistemic justice that I've briefly mentioned already. So I think there are close links between the idea of generative justice and the development of that idea in our network and the decolonizing project more broadly. But I wouldn't want to pretend that those connections have been more carefully drawn as yet than they have been. And lastly, and I'm really literally just throwing this into the mix as another bit of work in progress, which is related. So Marguerite Shinkler and I have just published a paper which is about tertiary desistance, which for those of you that aren't desistance scholars, concerns the question of belonging. When people are moving away from involvement in crime and involvement in criminalization, we talk about primary desistance as involving behavior change, secondary as involving identity change, and tertiary is about recognition, acceptance, and belonging. It depends on the reactions of others to the ways in which we change and evolve. And we've borrowed in this work from scholars of migration studies who use the concept of contested belonging to explore the experiences of those involved in migrations. And at the end of the paper, we developed this model of aspects and dynamics of belonging, which we think also apply to criminalized people and to people who've been adversely affected by the binary logics of northern and Western criminal justice systems, particularly those that are adversarially founded. So sorry that was such a Cook's tour, but I'll stop there to allow you to kind of pick up any bits that you think are worth discussing.